Hello everyone, my name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. So listen y'all, if you have been on the internet in the last week, you have likely seen the discourse about kink at Pride. And don't worry, I'm not here to talk about that subject. If you want to know about that, I will link in the description box below the live stream that I did on Wednesday last week where I talked about the whole thing in detail for like 4 hours. I will also link What's the Safe Word's latest video where they cover this subject in detail but in like a more condensed form. So we're not going to cover that. What we are going to do is I want to really go into detail with something I saw a lot when people were talking about kink at Pride. And essentially what it was like 10,000 vanilla people all repeating the same line: BDSM is inherently sexual. And I thought we had talked about this, but I guess a lot of people still have the understanding that BDSM is inherently sexual. Now, I did actually answer this question years and years ago on my channel. I have a very old video where I talk about this, and I don't have a problem with that video. I don't think it's wrong, but I do want to give an updated version that kind of contextualizes some things and also goes into a fair bit of actual science, because what a lot of people would say is essentially, all these reputable sources, aka Urban Dictionary, say that BDSM is inherently sexual, and if we are going to say that it's not, then we need academic resources that prove otherwise. And before we get into the actual answer to this question, is BDSM inherently sexual or not, I first need to go on a little bit of a rant on why we don't rely on academia for explaining BDSM concepts or giving the community particular definitions. So I have actually talked about this with several academics at this point. I actually have an interview with one known as Dr. Julie Fennell where we went over this in detail. And essentially what happens is, even in fields like sociology or anthropology, where you would expect people to be more comfortable going into areas like BDSM, there is still a lot of stigma around it, actually. And so what ends up happening is it's very hard to get research concepts even approved. It's hard to get funding, and then it's hard to find places that will actually publish that research. And moreover, that is not saying anything about the fact that when research is done on the BDSM community, it's not typically done by people that are also kinksters, which means that people are typically using outdated terminology. My favorite example of this is they still use SM or like S&M to refer to the BDSM community as a whole. That comes out of Kinsey's use of the term. But as far as the whole community goes, people haven't really largely used the term S&M or SM to refer to BDSM as a whole since around the 90s, with the rise of kink being online. BDSM became the much more preferred term. And so what happens is students are given outdated textbooks that use this incorrect terminology or explanations for BDSM, which means that every generation there are still people that work in fields like sexology that start out with a misconception about what we even talk about in the BDSM community, which I think is not really giving people a good place to even start their research from. And even in places like psychology, it has taken a very long time to get BDSM to be depathologized. I recently spoke with a person that is a licensed clinical social worker that started working with kinky clients about 15 years ago. They aren't kinky themselves, but what they noticed is that many of their colleagues had a deep stigma against BDSM, and what they would do is they would look at their client's interest in BDSM and then explain that interest by their mental illness, even if that correlation didn't really exist. And it wasn't until the DSM-5 came out in 2013 that we even got a meaningful delineation between just everyday consensual masochism and a masochistic disorder, which means you have generations of psychologists, the bulk of people currently practicing as therapists, with an antiquated view of BDSM and potentially a lack of understanding around that separation. So that means it's only very recently that many fields have started to change their view of BDSM. So I hope that makes it more clear why we don't always rely on academic explanations for BDSM, because it so often lags behind how the community sees itself. Not to mention the fact that it is still riddled with bias and the long-term effects of being pathologized. This has even been found to be the case in a recent review of available literature, with a 2019 study saying, for example, recent studies have found that textbooks and journals in both counseling and social work are glaringly sex negative and tend to ignore, sometimes purposefully, topics pertaining to kink and BDSM. So I think it is a perfectly valid sociological and anthropological approach to allow communities to self-define first, to have the BDSM community say, this is what we are, and then have the literature study that and reflect that. So instead, I will read a section of historian Peter Tupper's book, A Lover's Pinch, A Historical Guide to Sadomasochism. Sadomasochism is strongly defined by the legal and medical attempts to regulate it. Sadism and masochism were originally like homosexuality, medical terms that designated aberrant sexual behaviors exhibited by individuals. However, this book is less interested in sadistic or masochistic individuals than in sadomasochistic interactions between individuals, which are the root of sadomasochistic culture. Kinky can be defined as the opposite of vanilla, that is, quote, normal, but that definition is tautological. To create a working definition as a starting point, quote, BDSM is a form of consensual erotic play. While erotic may seem self-evident, it is actually much more complex. Sadomasochism and fetishism, along with homosexuality, became visible in the late 19th century because certain people were being aroused by things that did not fit the standard definition of, quote, normal sex. Heterosexual coitus leading to conception. However, many people practice BDSM or similar activities for reasons other than sexual arousal or release and prefer to keep their sexuality separate from their BDSM play. In a broader definition, BDSM is playing with the body, testing, modifying, experimenting. The goal may be physical pleasure, which may or may not include sexual arousal, or it may produce other sensations that the person desires. And Peter Tupper isn't the only one that is attempting to create a new way of viewing BDSM. Ethnographers like Stacy Newmar have actually proposed viewing BDSM as a form of serious leisure or recreation instead of kinky sex. A recent large quantitative study with a sample of several hundred BDSM practitioners found that general properties of leisure were overwhelmingly endorsed by participants, including the following items reported being present most or nearly always by 90% or more of the total sample. Positive emotions, a sense of freedom, pleasure and or enjoyment, a sense of adventure, stress relief and or relaxation, self-expression, and BDSM enjoyed for itself, intrinsic motivation. Notice how sexual release is not to be found on that list. And so I think that's where we can leave the academic discussion for now and instead pick up on if BDSM practitioners consider their relationship to BDSM to be inherently sexual or not. So first of all, I do want to recognize that BDSM can be inherently sexual for some people. There will always be people that see BDSM primarily or only as a sexual pursuit. For example, fetishists that only do BDSM in order to be able to do whatever it is that they have a fetish for. And there will always be people that keep their kinky activities strictly bedroom only, as we say in the lifestyle. But just because it is always sexual for some doesn't mean that it is always sexual for all. I think the most obvious example of this would be people that are asexual that participate in BDSM. I am one of those people. I identify as gray A, and my relationship to BDSM generally doesn't have anything to do with anything sexual at all. Like, I don't get aroused by most BDSM activities. I am not looking at BDSM as foreplay, for sex. I just generally don't consider my desire for BDSM mentally to be connected to sexual arousal or sexual desire in pretty much any way. And I'm not the only person, even just on YouTube. If you look around, a lot of BDSM educators are also on the ace spectrum. For example, Pup Amp, who is from What's the Safe Word, recently came out as demisexual, and Morgan Thorne, who is a femdom educator from Canada, is also on the ace spectrum. So we are far from a minority, and in fact, in real life, I know 2 male tops that are both asexual, and I know many of you that are watching this right now are also asexual and also do BDSM. And let's just say I don't really do this, but I want to prove a point. So if you are asexual, I would love it if you could leave a comment down below that includes either a cake emoji or a purple heart emoji down below, because I know so many of us ace kinksters feel really, really alone and like we're the only ones that are like this until we see how much of a community we really have. So I would love it if you guys could do that and we could just see how many kinky ace people there are out there, at least on my channel. And I know I said I was done with the academic literature, but there is one more study I want to talk about that pertains to asexuality and kink, and that would be ACE of BDSM clubs building asexual relationships through BDSM. Quote, current literature, whether produced by sexuality scholars or BDSM activists, primarily attributes BDSM's potential for academic study or personal empowerment and pleasure to its nature as a sexual practice. Most scholars, whether conducting field research or analyzing the subculture's history, interpret BDSM as inseparable from sexual desire and pleasure, regardless of whether intercourse occurs or whether informants describe their own behavior as erotic. Weinberg et al. Describes BDSM as blatantly sexual, even though intercourse may be ancillary or absent in practitioners' scenes. No literature considers whether BDSM can foster connections that do not stem from sexual desire, let alone whether it can sustain asexual relationships. While identifying as asexual enables informants to articulate their lack of interest in sexual relationships, participating in BDSM helps them form partnerships based on attractions they do feel and fantasies they do wish to realize. In addition to setting physical boundaries, negotiation also enables asexual practitioners to proactively communicate that scenes will not cause them to feel sexual desire and stipulate that partners should not expect or hope for the scene to have this effect. Asexual practitioners demonstrate that BDSM provides discursive spaces and conceptual frameworks for fostering and validating intimate exchanges that do not derive from or rely on sexual desire. Their experiences encourage a second look at BDSM practice, one acknowledging that sexual attraction is not a ubiquitous component of BDSM, and exploring a new dimension of communication that BDSM practice can facilitate. And I think, as this study implies, understanding BDSM as being something other than inherently sexual is something that not only helps asexual kinksters, but also members of the BDSM community as a whole. Because people engage in kink for so many reasons, and that could be something that's non-sexual, and even when it is, it can also be something that is sexual in a secondary way or goes alongside other motivations that may actually be more important. It can be about the deep bonding that happens after a scene. It can be about the feeling of care and loving when you do aftercare. It can be about the extreme sensations and the pursuit of them, such as you might find with going on a tall roller coaster or skydiving, or wanting to engage in physical pleasure beyond the merely sexual. It can be because you want to feel free to be able to play and explore even as an adult. It can be about cultivating a spiritual experience or exploring the taboo. It can be because you want to have stress relief, freedom from everyday worries, or simply shutting off your brain for a period of time. It can be about wanting to have structure for your relationship, or clear boundaries, or wanting to be a part of a community where you can be 100% yourself without any reservations. It can be about feeling comfortable and in control of your interactions with other people and in your relationships. It can even promote a sense of empowerment. Of course, this is not a complete list, but I hope that does a good job of illustrating some of the many reasons why people do BDSM beyond just the sexual. And I'll also add that it is relatively rare to see full-on intercourse at a BDSM dungeon. Now, you will see things like oral sex or using a vibrator on someone, but those aren't really used in the way that you might understand it from a vanilla sexual context. I've maybe seen full-on intercourse maybe 5 or 6 times in the 6.5 years I've been going to dungeons, so hopefully that illustrates that for many people, even when they do engage in sex, it's not really so much about arousal as it can be about power and public display. And this is to say nothing of the people that have ongoing BDSM relationships. While you might have sexual motivations as a backbone for engaging in DS, it is very hard to have a sustainable relationship where you are only doing the things that are sexually arousing. There is typically at least some time where you are not actively aroused by the things you are doing to maintain feeling either dominant or submissive. While you might enjoy role-playing being a master or slave in the bedroom, it takes way more than just whatever gets your rocks off to make being a master or a slave really work, especially in the long term. And I think that's everything I want to cover today. I hope using these academic resources alongside my perspective as a kind of somewhat long-term community member to illustrate that yes, BDSM can be sexual for some, but not sexual for all. So if you do have additional questions, you can leave that down in the comment section below. I will also have links to as many studies as I can down in the description box if you would like to read them for yourself. And if you do like videos like this one, please do subscribe because I make videos twice a week about all sorts of kink and BDSM related topics. And also, if you would like to support my channel, the best way that you can do that is via Patreon. YouTube has now demonetized my channel twice in just the most bizarre ways possible, and I don't understand it. They have now said that both times it was a mistake. However, you never know when there might be a third time and it could actually be permanent. YouTube is just this really unknowable, weird force that is impossible to communicate with. So instead of relying on YouTube to pay my bills and make these videos possible, that is what Patreon is for. Patreon has always been really, really good to me as a quote, not safe for work content creator, and that is what my actual livelihood is. So if you want to support me, Patreon is definitely the way to go. And if you do already support me over there, thank you so, so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you guys next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.